Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, sir. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good.
It's a little
We're a
colder today
little
here
bit
in Philly.
colder. I got my fire started. Oh, you know what else? I brought something for show and tell.
Okay. That's
I
exciting.
brought. Let me go get it and bring it closer. It's Manolo,
Oh, yeah.
which is one of my sculptures. I actually have done more sculpture. Get 'em up there. Have done more sculpture than painting. Painting's really a relatively recent chapter. And what's fun about this is Manolo is from South America, and he was one of the last generation. I don't know if you can see it there on the forehead, but he was one of the last generation where they actually bound the heads to create a. I guess they say it increases visual acuity for hunting. But anyway, I realized that I like the way it came out, but it does look like a little strange thing on the forehead, but people don't realize that that's why. So it looks like I just kind of made him a cone head. I wasn't very good at, but but actually, this was like my first real bronze that I've done. So I did do some other. I used to do welding sculpture more, and when I was working
I'm
as a
not too
sculptor.
familiar with bronze sculpture. Is that cast?
It's cast, yeah.
Okay.
So you use an oil-based modeling clay, and then they make a mold over it, usually with a layer of like silicone, and then they cast plaster around it, so you can take it apart, and that's why it's reproducible. So you can do limited editions and things like that.
Cool.
But yeah, I did a few different pieces in that medium, but mostly what I was doing when I was really making sculpture, I worked for another sculptor, and I would weld armatures, the inside pieces, the skeleton that you don't ever really see, but the shape of the creature has to be in there. So I did a lot of that, mostly horses.
Yeah, I remember seeing some of your horses.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to include those in a future show and tell.
Yeah, I do have a little version, a maquette of one because we used to do life size,
Hmm.
but I don't have any of those.
Yeah.
but but yeah, no, it's kind of an interesting thing. I started with 3D and then I got into 2D later. I would always do like construction drawings, but never final product drawings, where the drawing itself was the final product until I started doing these. But this isn't kind of on the topic we were talking about is the effects of time, and do we run with it and do we use it, or do we get it? Does it just blow by us like the guy in the old Bose commercial? Do you remember that guy?
Yeah, with the Maxwell, Maxell.
Oh, Maxell, that's what it was. Sitting in
Yeah,
the chair and
in the
everything's blowing.
chair, the speaker's blowing his hair back. Yeah,
Temporality, we could call that, huh?
yeah. So what we were talking about before we hit record today, I think is a good topic, and there's a little bit of a mix of things. So one theme is as we get older, and we've done a previous episode on chapters and transitions, and of course that's a theme that we're going to reprise because I think that's a basic building block of our shared worldview, right? So that's just going to keep coming up.
And a
So
theme of
as
life, yes.
what's that?
A theme of life.
Yeah, right. So as we get older and hopefully grow up, how we approach stuff changes, and there's what you called an updating process that also happens. And then there's a theme of if we don't update, And if how we approach things doesn't continue to evolve, what does the universe have to say about that? And that kind of takes us into what is karma. And I think we have slightly different models of what karma is. And so I'll be curious to see those come out. And I
Mhm,
think I could learn something about how to think about karma.
mhm,
And then another thing we were just talking about that may or may not tie into this, I guess we'll see, is how do we interpret the vibe shift that's going on? Uh, and I'm using the phrase vibe shift because I read a Neil Ferguson article this morning in the Free Press where he refers to vibe shift
definitely.
around the transition from the Obama Biden legacy to Trump and what's going on in the Middle East, including Syria, what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, um, how the world order is shifting, and what does that mean culturally? So there's like a collective growing up or a collective evolution maybe going on there too.
Mhm,
So we
yeah,
those are kind of the threads we're pulling on.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the thing that I immediately think about with karma, the idea of karma, which I think the original idea of this had to do with seeds, uh, seeds of things that later grow. And in the Tao, Lao Tzu says that the sage deals with things when they're just seeds. And so he never has to deal with any great problems because he nips them all before there's even a bud, before the seed is germinated, right? And so the way I tend to see that is it sort of dovetails into some of the psychological conversations that we've had, in that in many ways our karma is tied up with our cognitive model. So we will, there's a saying that when a person walks by a pickpocket, all the pickpocket sees are pockets. And there's, I think that the nature of this cognitive model that we carry, that we talked about, that we've referred to as the semantic world, the picture that I have of reality, that and it might be good for us to reprise that idea of the coast of Norway. Have we talked about that recently?
We have, but yeah, can't hurt.
Might be worth elaborating. There's this question: how long is the coast of Norway? And of course, it's nothing special about Norway here, but I mean, particular. This will apply to any coastline. In other words, I love Norway, but the idea is that, well, you get a distance for the line of for the coastline, and then you realize that, well, that measurement was based on certain methods that we went about to take it. And that is, there are places where maybe there was a jagged section of coastline, but at the resolution of our measurement, we just made a straight line go across there. And so as we increase the resolution, you might say we're using smaller and smaller straight lines, but those straight lines will never approximate the actual curve. And so, uh, putting aside the fact that the actual coastline changes with every wave, when we get down to that resolution, what it ends up being is that we're not really measuring the coastline, we're just sort of measuring the resolution that we're measuring at. Because we can always get more accurate, that means that the actual coastline is really infinite. So, or practically infinite. Maybe there's a distinction there. But so so that's kind of the way that our models work. We can't handle everything all the way out to all the final decimal places. So we settle for approximations to stand in for things. And the vast majority of the time, those are serviceable. Those work well enough. But there is this idea that we always kind of miss something. There's always a degree that we can't capture. And so when we build cognitive models, we don't do this necessarily consciously, although we may, which is an interesting conversation. We're built our cognitive model is the picture or the internal version of reality that we form as we grow. Remember we spoke, I think last time about how we don't ever start the story at the first chapter. We're always thrown into life in the middle of the book somehow. So we kind of have to form this model of what do I do? What are these things out here? How do I get my needs fulfilled? What's a threat? What and we build this cognitive model, and everybody's is a little bit different. And that's what we mean when we say that everyone is born with their foot nailed down in a particular room, in a particular house, on a particular street, in a particular part of a particular city, in a particular country, that each one of those is a qualifier of that cognitive model. You grew up in this room because you were the second child, and the second child gets this kind of an impact different than the first child or the third child. And you grew up on that street because that was the milieu, maybe it was a socioeconomic thing that put you in that on that street, or maybe it was a cultural thing that puts you on that street. And then as this picture goes up, more premises that get loaded on into your cognitive model.
I
Was
just
that
want to
did you wanna
interject just on
Mhm.
principle that this is why the idea of privilege is an extremely low resolution way of looking at the world.
Slippery
Because
slope. Yeah.
the people that we look at and consider privileged have their foot just as nailed down as anybody else in a particular room, in a particular house, et cetera, et cetera. And it's so foolish to turn down the resolution so much as to let our envy that we think their room and their house is any better when we could think just as easily that they're just as nailed down as we are. That really gets under my skin, and I
Yeah,
just have to go on record
yeah.
when that comes up.
And the lemma to that is that there are ways of being nailed down that you can't even imagine, that
Yeah,
are other people's daily reality.
absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's part of this creating this space for the part that you know you can't ever compute and bring accurately into your model so that you can operate on it, right? So all of that can amount to karma, right?
So, can make that connection clearer?
Well, because this is the model that you go to operate out of, and that model has certain ises. That things that show up as ises to you, but they aren't really ises. They're just ises to you because that's what it looks like with your cognitive model.
I see. So the cognitive model itself has limitations, blind spots, low resolution, and those shortcomings of the model are the seeds of karma.
And the instant karma, right? That idea that it happens with my interaction because I carry these seeds with me. And so part of, so say I carry that seed with me and I go into the world and it grows. And then a result comes from that seed that then impacts my cognitive model. And maybe I can make an adjustment in that cognitive model, and maybe now that karma has been burnt away because now I've taken that impression. And so the idea of karma through lifetimes just says that those seeds can carry with us across incarnations. But I think that what that does though is this picture of karma. It points the light on our consciousness. It puts the light on our presuppositions. It 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 spotlights the changeability of those things. And so then we're able to actually perform a self-reflexive function and actually grow through that, through this feedback machine of karma, if you will. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the way a Buddhist would explain it. But for me, this is a mechanism that I experience, and it generates the same results that people point at and say, "Well, that was karma."
It's
So
interesting because kind of basing the understanding of karma on the cognitive model create it provides a framework that I think makes it much easier to make sense of karma, say for the Western mind. I think I think I have some idea of how a Buddhist would explain karma.
It explains collective karma too.
Let's come back to that.
Okay.
Um, but the way I think about karma, I think fits into that model, and I think is informed by it. So I think I'm upgrading here
Mhm.
by adding the cognitive model piece. But the way I think about it is kind of no matter what choices we make, and we have free will, I think, no matter what choices we make, there are certain things we're going to trip over and certain lessons we're going to learn in a given lifetime. So, and the way we know that is because when we get to the end of a lifetime, we look back and have a sense of, well, that makes sense. That that these things happened makes sense. And I've heard this from people who were dying, where they say things like, "I realize now that there's nothing to have regret about at all." Um, and and I think that kind of statement can mean a few things, but the fundamental thing that I think it means is everything happens for a reason, or there's a Hebrew prayer that says everything is in its place,
Mhm.
and we can't predict or assume looking forward how that's going to go with the same resolution as we can looking back.
Clearly.
And so it's a given that we're going to learn certain lessons. We're going to go through some suffering. We're going to cause some suffering. And that's all kind of karmic, because when we get to the other end of it, we will have integrated some learning and some understanding as a result. That's my model.
Uh-huh.
But putting that in the context of the cognitive model makes it better, because then I can see that what causes the lack of resolution looking forward is the foot being nailed down in a particular room in a particular house, and that's just the thrownness that results in this karmatic experience. So
Karma is the nail.
that's helpful. So two things: the how would a Buddhist explain karma? And then how does using the cognitive model as a basis for understanding karma explain collective karma?
Right. Well, I think that the Buddhist explanation would be similar but more pervasive, as in even a bigger version of that. Our identity might be, and I think this changes from different Buddhist group to Buddhist group, but our personal identity might be little more than that cognitive worldview imbued with fears and desires. And again, Lao Tzu quotes the ancients when he says, "What we value and what we fear is within ourself." And in the noble path, the way we get, or the four noble truths, the way we get around suffering is through the disillusion of the ego, which is to say, having some effect on that internal cognitive model map, uh, that sort of defines self and our place within it for us. And so the collectivity of that is that there are some things that we share with everybody else in that house, by virtue of being in the same house, and there are things that we share with everybody on the same street by virtue of being in the same street, and et cetera, up and up and up. So a national karma, yes, if we share certain cognitive assumptions, we're going to collectively reap the rewards or the punishments that go with those collective assumptions. And that's why certain nationalities have certain characteristics that are based on not just affinities like, oh, we like to eat this food, or we live in this environment, so we live in this kind of houses, but also certain value system things that sort of translate in different ways. Uh,
Just to go down this rabbit hole a little bit, how do you square that with experiencing in the United States, and I think in the West in general right now, what I think is a high degree of polarization. Um, I think what you're proposing is that there are values underlying the polarization that are common. Uh, or maybe another way of saying that is the polarization is reaction to those values and therefore a karmatic relationship with those values, whether one is pulling the oar in one direction or the other.
Right. Well, and I mean, we had this collectivity that we called the United States that was defined by certain things. And then we had a cognitive model that formed in the South and a cognitive model that formed in the North that were antithetical to the point of cannon fodder, cannon fire. So just like two people within the same house might have conflicting uh, cognitive models, so on all the way scaled through the model. And I think that this is where the conversation about influencers or media or Operation Mockingbird or any of these things are all sort of subsumed in my mind under the category of the conflict of cognitive models. And this is where the resolution of cognitive models comes in also, because a lot of these apparent dichotomies, as we've spoken about before, and the resolution of paradoxes or dissolving the yin and yang into the one, uh, that that the higher resolution often solves these problems. But that higher resolution takes a certain capacity. It takes that being installed as a plug-in to your cognitive model, and that's where what this says, basically, this model says that learning is fundamental, right? That growing up never ends, that there's always this expansion that's possible that will make your cognitive model more powerful, And that's why I've said that when we drill down into this, it is an a cognitive model. I actually am a proponent of the multi-model method, which is the science of hermeneutics that says that when I'm perceiving science, I use one model to grok it, to understand it. When I'm perceiving Mozart and I'm listening to a piece, I'm using a total different set of cognitive apparatus to bring meaning into me. And then I changed those set of I changed that apparatus based on the field I'm focused on. And, so but it really does say that the expansion of consciousness or the enrichment of that cognitive model yields power and it yields more awareness and more consciousness. I think that when later on, when we have some future conversations that I think will be future, the way things come out, we'll talk about how that cognitive the limitations to that cognitive model, and that it's very important that a part of that model is its limitations, that we know where to leave it off. Uh, I often think of the Windows thing and how to shut it off. You're supposed to push the on button, or it used to be start, right? I think there was a, and it's interesting how we have a way to turn on this computational apparatus, but where's the off button? Well, that's kind of disguised, right? And I'm not saying that you turn it off, but I'm saying that maybe it shifts gears, or maybe we know where to leave it off and to allow for the ineffable, to allow for the incommensurable, the mystery of the creation to have its own place.
I mean, that's kind of a comment on the end of the utility of a cognitive model, but there's another way of looking at it, which is the continual updating that also needs to happen. So there's both the recognizing when the model doesn't serve, and we want to just try to experience. But
Right.
there's also the how do we recognize when the cognitive model needs to be updated, when we need better resolution, when we need to look at the fjords on the coastline of Norway a little more carefully. And what you had suggested earlier is that, well, when karma kicks our ass because the seeds of the low resolution have flowered into some problem now.
Yep.
And so are there ways of thinking about those problems? Are there categories like What kinds of problems do we encounter when our resolution on the cognitive model is inadequate? How do we know?
Well, I think first of all, there's the unknown, but part of the unknown is the unknowable, and part of it is the just not known yet. So we can push back into the not known yet territory, but the unknowable, we need a different mode or we need a different relationship with it. And at the same time, I think that there is a spectrum based on our wisdom as to how we deal with those seeds growing. And that if we're really sharp, as soon as that seed cracks open and the radical starts to come out, it's on our screen and we weed it out of the garden. But some of us, and so, or maybe just some areas of our individual cognitive models are so not lit up yet that it has to grow into a full fledged somebody attacking you with a weapon or like your cognitive model you know you're going to get feedback. We get feedback every which way, right? In fact, I was just hearing about a thing between high context languages and cultures and low context languages of cultures. They're comparing the UK and America, and the example that the girl used was she said a British person said to her, "Will you go upstairs and see if the window's open?" And she went up and checked, and I guess there were still people upstairs, and she saw that the window was open, and she came down and she said, "Yeah, the window's still open." She's American. It was the British person that asked him to go. And then the Brit said to her, "Well, did you close it?" And she said, "No, well, no. You didn't tell me to close it." Right? Well, that was understood by the context, apparently. Uh, Americans are more literal, was the argument that she was making. And that the British approach puts a lot more on subtler clues.
Hmm.
And maybe this is because America is a mixing pot of so many different cultures, or maybe something more pragmatic. I don't know. But the idea was that the clues you were supposed to read into were different. And so my point is just that we're getting clues all the time. I mean, one clue is when the cop throws you across the hood of the car and cuffs you. That's a clue that somehow your cognitive model was impacting reality in a way, unless that's what you were after. I won't rule that out. Uh, but another clue is when someone just doesn't respond exactly the way that you maybe thought that they would or they should, or that, so that might be a really subtle clue. And maybe our wisdom is determined by how much awareness we can pull into translate into feedback on our models so we can upgrade.
Hmm.
Uh, and I mean, I think that that's been my experience of growing up was, realizing at times when I was out of line. And then the environment tells me that one way or the other. And then I have to go, oh, I guess I was out of line. You know, uh, I think for me, for example, it was a time, there were times when my competitive nature got engaged. And I realized that, okay, I could maybe push this beyond what other considerations might recommend. Right. And so I had to learn to, okay, if that gets engaged, then maybe I need to pump the brakes. Right. And then I had a lot of people that were suggesting that I should become an attorney. Uh, but I knew that there was a good likelihood that that would be constantly engaging my competitive nature, and I didn't think that I wanted to become that person. I didn't think that that was going to push me in the right direction, although it was clear to me that I could have done it. And then I had friends that grew up with or went to college with who did that, who became attorneys, and they were like, "Yeah, you can do this. It's no big deal." And so, at the same time, I come back to the I Ching, that one section of the sage that helped Wilhelm translate it, and I call him a sage because he really was special, I think. Uh, where he says, we understand a person's character by what elements of their personality do they choose to encourage. And I think that's real important, because that sort of says it doesn't matter where your foot nailed down, where you started at, where that foot was nailed down. But if you do put in the right kind of effort, your cognitive model will upgrade and your character will upgrade as a result of that.
Can you say more about what elements of the personality we put energy into? Because I guess I think of the personality as more superficial than where the energy might go.
Yeah, and I mean those were his translation of the Chinese. But I think that I mean the idea is, who do I want to become? Under what influences do I want to form myself? Who is the me that my instinct or intuition tells me I can meet and become into the future? And I've said before that I think everybody has a certain soul itch, and that they're going to scratch that soul itch no matter what you do or no matter who tries to influence them. And I think that's also an aspect of karma. And it's also this idea of, uh, you know, I was teaching kung fu years ago, and I went to go to a place. Did I mention this before? That was being run by a bunch of deconstructionists,
Yeah, I think so.
and they didn't like the idea of setting good examples. They thought that that was oppressive,
Hmm.
to set a good example. My personal experience is that when I was young, I had teachers that were super impactful for me, and I did not feel oppressed by them. I did feel pushed by them. I remember one point Peter talking about Cho, and he'd say, "Man, when Cho was pushing me, I would just hate him, but then as soon as it was over, I liked him again." Okay. It's like, well, that's part of what a teacher does. And part of what evolution does is it pushes us. It's only oppression if we're stuck between something that won't move and that pressure. And that thing that needs to move with a teacher is you. If a teacher oppresses you, you're not a good student or they're not a good teacher. If the teacher student relationship is right, the student gets somewhere they would never have gotten without the teacher. And I mean, I think we've all experienced that if we're honest with ourselves. So, so who do we pick as a teacher? We pick people who maybe a way to think about it is, do I want my life to look like their lives?
Mm.
Or maybe that's too simplistic. It's more like, maybe, do I want to be able to face my life with the resources that they have been able to face their life with, based on how they developed them?
More the internal condition that we might not even be
Yeah,
able to
yeah.
name, but we intuit or sense, and we're like, yeah, I could use some of that. This
Right.
person has some sand in their belly or whatever.
Exactly. I was a Midwest kid that got moved to the East Coast, where things were moving fast and hard compared to what I was used to. And it was very useful for me. I ended up studying with a guy who survived 2 tours of duty in Vietnam as a Green Beret. I needed some of that, right? And we have this saying, soft students need to be hardened and hard students need to be softened. And I was a soft student and I needed to be hardened, right? I was, as we mentioned before in our previous episode, I was a dragon that needed to be tigerized.
Yeah, I relate to that one, right? When I met you, my background was essentially academic and intellectual, and there was a lot of debating and a lot of science and facts and
Thinking.
yeah, thinking. And early on in our relationship, you said something to me about thinking not being the only source of development, and I remember disagreeing, and I think I kept it to myself. Um, but some part of me reserved judgment and was open to being open to looking at that differently. And sure enough, I went through a chapter of psychic and spiritual development, and then a chapter of kind of emotional and psychological development, and then I had a much more complete cognitive model. Not that it's complete by any stretch, but um, and I could always use more tiger, you know. Everything I just said was still more in the dragon realm, and um, I've been talking to my wife Ray about, maybe we should build a house instead of buying one out here. Um, and my main motivation for doing that is to have the tiger experience. And I built some of the house in New Mexico, but I had a lot of help too. And there was a lot of stuff that I was afraid of taking on myself because it was too complex, or I was afraid of
Mhm.
screwing it up, that
Yep.
I might want another look at.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I if people look at what I do now or the way that I have shown up, I was running the water system in the town, uh, doing municipal plumbing. I've built buildings. I've made sculpture, as you saw. In other words, I'm creating artifacts. And one might look superficially and say, "Oh, that's what my thrownness was to make stuff." But actually, I started out very much like you. I was, I'll say, poorly socialized as a child, so I had ended up reading a lot of books, which I still, it's not like any of that has stopped. But I read an explanation of the why Buddhists beg, why monks beg, and it was very much that idea to bring them down here. They're spending all this time in these ethereal realms. But like my Zen master said, in the world of God, there are no bathrooms and no restaurants. And so there's something about grounding us, right? That coming to terms with our ass, for it bears us. The reason that we have a physical body, and not just a brain in a glass like on Futurama, uh, is because there are important aspects to that physicality. And my thrownness was certainly towards language and words and books and thinking. And uh, my dad worked for IBM, and their motto was think. And so I'd see that everywhere, and I was definitely incentivized, oh, you do good in school. And that's like, oh, you're so smart. You should do this. You should do that, but always intellectual, intellectual, intellectual with this. And when I get to reading John Dewey and The Quest for Certainty, he talks about this idea that there's something base about working in material, that there's something dirty and ugly about it, right? Uh, so that's why the guy that comes and makes your toilet flush is somehow not as valued as the person that you go to for counsel about legal matters, because legal matters are so, y- you know, and have you ever tried to live with a backed up toilet? You'll be a lot happier to see your plumber at the door than your attorney if your toilet is backed up. This is our affairs of plain living, right?
Depends if you're renting or owning.
Yeah, well, there's that. Yeah, you'll fear both if you're owning,
Yeah.
yes.
I wanted to go back to something you said, and I don't know if there's a there, but I'm curious about it. You said the soul itch is another component of karma, and I wondered if we can take another step in integrating the soul itch with the cognitive model view on karma. So, is it the like where is the soul itch in the model of the foot being nailed down in a particular room in a particular house, etc.? Um, is it part of that, or is it a separate thread altogether?
I think it's in the processor and not on the display, to use Langan's
Okay,
recent mo yeah,
lay
I
it
mean, does
out.
that make sense? That we have those, one of the reasons I like that thing that I just heard about, what's his first name?
Chris Langan. But yeah, you might
Chris
want to
Lang.
explain it a little bit.
Yeah, he was talking. I mean, I don't know how much I can explain. He's worth checking out, and his cognitive model theories. And he's got a lot of interesting understandings, like the interviewer, which I think was Mark Knowles. Uh, he said, "Does God exist?" And he said, "Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah, he's
yeah, yes."
unequivocal. Yeah.
No, yeah, yeah. I mean, he didn't
And
pause.
and this is a guy that might have the highest measured IQ in the world.
They're thinking around 200,
Yeah.
somewhere like that. And I showed it to Annie. She said, "He looks like a plumber."
I
And
think
I said,
he's a
"Hey."
bricklayer or something. I mean, he's a
And I said, "Hey." You know, Socrates was a bricklayer.
yeah.
Socrates
I
didn't write
oh,
anything
he
down.
maybe he was a rancher. Chris Langan was a rancher.
Oh, that's right, I think I heard that.
Yeah, in Montana, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amongst other things, of
Yeah.
course,
Yeah.
being at that level of things, you know? And, but anyway, so they were asking, say, "Well, what is God?" You know, and we've talked about this a little bit. If God exists, what is it? He, you know, she, whatever. Uh, and that's where he said, we talked about this before where I think I referred to Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, who said that his idea was that God was immanent in the universe, right? So, and Langen mentioned this also. There is, we have the term pantheism, right, which is like the idea of multiple gods, right? But you have this idea, which is a term that I just heard for the first time, actually, pantheism, pantheism, pantheism,
I think it's
pantheism.
panentheism, no?
Panentheism, that's it, panentheism, which is this Baruchian or Spinozan idea of God in the universe, which I think is right. But what Langen says is, and there's a little left over, so that they're not equal. That God is all of that and a little more, and that's why it's generative. That's why it's about process and not static states. And of course, this is my dumbed down model of please go check him out because there's a lot in there. And I thought he dovetails in with the conclusions that Fagin was coming to, Federico
Yeah,
Fagin, very much so.
Langan talks about that the reality we experience is a projection, and that God is both the projection and the projector, and that
Right.
and that we're trying to make sense of that in order for us to make sense of the projection, we have to account for there also being a projector. And so what you just said about the soul itch being part of the projector and the cognitive model being part of the projection, I wonder if you can elaborate on that at all.
Well, Langen said, the part that I really liked was he said that if we were doing this right, we would be inhabiting the best of all possible worlds. And I'm like, yes, exactly right. Exactly right. And so, to my mind, he reaffirms the idea of the omega point of the eschaton that we spoke about before, that this is all about something, and that it's intimately connected with us and how we experience what's going on and how we are about it. And we could say that this person that I potentially, the person that I would be were we in the best of all possible worlds, that would be the best of all possible me's. And so that's the me in the mind of God in the projector. And now, as we go through this, because we do have free will, and he talks about that as a very interesting element of things. Um, it's how that free will aligns itself that has to do with the display. And so I think that when we're dealing with our cognitive models and us trying to map things, that's all part of the display. But
I'm
this
just
thing that
I'm just
urges us
realizing that
forward is the projector.
the free will debate um, and the way that shows up in this paradoxical way makes me think of it as the connector between projector and projection, because the paradox itself I think is right on, that we have free will and we don't have free will, but we have free will and we don't have, like, there's I think that's the like when we're connected to the projector, we have it, and when we're entirely in the projection, we don't, maybe is a way of thinking about that.
Yeah, or that, Crowley pops up whenever we don't expect him. He talks about your true will, capital T, capital W. And the idea of your true will is completely harmonious with God's will. You are who you're supposed to be. And it's natural. You would want to be who you're supposed to be. Why wouldn't you? If if I mean, that's where it all just sort of fits together, so that there is, uh, what's the prayer? Thy will be done. But what we're really after is put me in a cognitive position to where thy will and my will, they're the same. And then that's why they say aham brahmasmi, right? I am Brahman. Uh, but that's a very rarefied state of consciousness that there does seem to be evidence that some people manage to attain.
So let's go back just for a sec to the eschaton and the idea that if we were doing this right, we would be living in the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah. That's almost a quote from Langan, pretty much word for word.
Yeah, yeah, I remember him saying that.
Yeah.
Um, the skeptic in me wants to respond with something along the lines of the suffering that life includes might also be a source of meaning. And I was going to say the source of meaning, but I think I'll keep it at a source of meaning.
Uh-huh.
And is the suggestion that the best of all possible worlds is beyond suffering? And if so, are there implications for meaning, or are we just does that not matter because it's just this utopian like pipe dream anyway?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there is a transformation of suffering, perhaps, or that maybe we do end up with a place. I'm not a Buddhist, so I can't speak perfectly on this. Uh, but uh, my Zen master used to say, when you're sitting and your legs hurt, because a lot of times until people try to do this, they think it's like, oh, it's just
Just
sitting,
relax. Yeah.
it's so easy. It's like your back hurts, your knees hurt, your leg. And so Roshi used to say, "Who feels this pain?" And whenever I'm in an uncomfortable situation, like I'm in the hole in the water doing the wrenching and all that, I try to use that reflexive element to it. Can I follow this as a thread? Will this lead me to the center of the onion, if you will? And and I think we talked about that in the in about suffering, the episode about suffering, uh, that there is something like it's I don't know what the best analogy is, but it's the grist for the mill idea, that through the pounding to make the best steel, or the polishing of the surface, or the wearing away of all the not God. And then then how could there be suffering, I guess, would be the conclusion of that. So when there's nothing left but God.
Yeah, yeah. So living in the physical world might still entail the catalysts for suffering, but the response of suffering might no longer exist.
Yeah, something like that, or I mean, I've really felt in ways that I can't express in ceremonies, the necessity of suffering, the sacredness of suffering, the the purification of suffering, all of which is much more easily understood when you're not suffering. It seems like. I mean, and this is Job, right? And Carl Jung's famous piece, "An Answer to Job." There's a lot there. There's a lot there, and so so I think that, I mean, the most practical advice I have on that is just that you want to bring your awareness into it and bring yourself to it. And like I said before, there's an instinct to retract something, and there's actually a way to just be with it and push your way through it. And a certain level of metaphysical acceptance, maybe, or something like that. They call it, there's an old idea called amori fati. Have you ever heard of that?
Sounds familiar.
The love of fate.
Uh-huh.
And so there is some sort of it's called love of fate, but I feel that there is some, before that happens, there has to be some release to the acceptance of fate, of the fitness of fate, or the fairness of God, or say it as you will.
It's kind of like what I was saying about getting to the end of the road and looking back and saying there's nothing to have regrets
Yeah,
about or
yeah,
guilt about, or like everything happened the way it needed to happen.
yeah. One of my teachers used to just say, "God is fair. God is fair," as as an explanation as much as a means of self-consolation, I think,
Yeah.
you know, it's just like, "So it is, and so it is," and it passes our understanding.
I've heard from, I don't remember where I heard this, but that mindfulness practices are being used for pain management, and
Oh,
that
makes
if
sense.
we actually bring our attention to pain and allow ourselves to really experience it, we can hold it much more readily than when we're in resistance to it and trying to avoid it. It doesn't mean pain doesn't hurt. That's kind of
Right.
what it is by definition. But I have had the experience of a severe toothache, and I just had to find a way to deal with it. And
Uh-huh.
one of the ways of dealing with it was remembering that pain is essentially an electrical impulse, and it's not an actual physical thing. It's a signal of a physical thing that might be happening, but it's also very much illusory, and it can be held that way. And if you're sitting there experiencing pain and realizing it's illusory at the same time, that it's just an electrical signal, interesting things can happen. Like it can hurt and not hurt at the same time and stuff like that.
Yep, yep, or at least you get the consciousness is separate
Right.
from the physicality. Yeah. No, I was once, when I was down in Florida, I don't know whether I used to like to eat oysters a lot, and I guess sometimes there's issues with those, and, I it was when I was living in Peter's school, and, I just got this some kinda sickness where I got this insane headache, to the point where if I laid down, that little increase of blood pressure in my head made it crazy, and I slept the whole night with the bed pushed up into a corner, so I could just slump into the corner, and I actually reached the point where I said, "I can't take this." Uh, and then the ridiculousness of that hit me immediately, which is you're gonna take it, right? And now Peter had been in the Green Beret, jumped out of an airplane, issues with the parachute, broke his back when he landed in a swampy area, was in the hospital for a year, and he was in a medical coma, and he told me that it was so bad that when he started to come back to consciousness, he'd immediately start calling the nurse right away because the pain was so intense, and so he had some pain pills that were like pain pills, and, I think he gave me a couple of those, and he said, "You can't take any more of these. Like, that's all you can take of these." And as I recall describing it at the time, it took the pain from here and made it about here. But it was still, like, on the borderline of making you insane, you know? And, I wish I could say I had more of a transformative experience out of that than I did, but I was pretty young, and I didn't really all I knew was to grit my teeth and sit through it, and I came out the other end, and,
I think
there
the
was a
very
learning there.
experience of getting to the threshold of "I can't take this," and then the leveling up of, "Yeah, I'm gonna though," is formative and transformative.
It's eating bitter, and it's, like,
Yeah.
as bitter can get, you can't even spit it out. Yeah, yeah. And there is something about understanding our capacities, you know? It's what I was thinking about this morning when I woke up, I couldn't see my breath, I don't heat during the night, and, I think when I got downstairs, it was 44, and, I noticed, okay, it's 44, but it isn't the conversation isn't in my head like it could be, because this is a type of suffering that I'm used to, and so I don't think about it that much. I'll go, "Oh, boy, it's cold," like I still have an outhouse, and it'll be cold maybe, and I'll go out of the outhouse, and I'll be thinking, "Wow, this is cold," but I'm not thinking I'm gonna put in a septic system and a bathroom, and I could do it myself. I've built septic systems, I've built bathrooms, I know how to do this all, but I've adapted to it in a way so that the what I experience is not that brutal. And what I often remind myself and others is that, 150, 200 years ago, like when Thoreau was writing 179 years ago, everybody had this lived in this reality. Maybe somebody got up in the middle of the night to stoke the fire so that maybe it was warmer than 44 when they get up, but is getting up in the middle of the night every 2 hours to stoke the fire, is that not its own kind of suffering?
It's only worth doing if it's like -20. Then
Exactly,
you get up every
exact
2 hours.
yeah, and I just think, Wim Hof would be proud of me.
Remind me who Wim Hof was? That sounds so familiar.
Wim Hof is the guy who's done, climbed Everest in shorts and has the world's
Oh,
record for being submerged in ice water, but he has a teachable method
uh-huh.
for how you do this, and so do the Tibetans. It's called tumo, and they can generate heat to the point where they measure someone's capacity by they sit, you know, naked in the wintertime and they break a hole in the ice, they drop the sheets in, and they throw the wet sheets onto the guy, and rolls of steam come off. And if you ever read anything by Alexandra David Neal, Neel, I think it is, uh, incredible book. She traveled through Tibet in the 20s and 30s, and she described seeing people doing longompa, which is a way to traverse long distances in a sort of a trance state that monks would use to go from monastery to monastery. And she was told you can't interrupt their trance because they may not be able to get back into it, and then they're just stuck out in the wilderness. Uh, but Tumo, for a short period of time, I did Kundalini yoga, and in fact, we were laughing about it today because there was a point when my kung fu school in town, we didn't have heat. And uh, Annie was remembering, he said, that winter, all these people would come in sick, living in their heated homes. And we didn't get sick at all that year, living in this super cold environment.
Mhm.
And so there is something about the physiology of dealing with your environment and how your environment controls you in your responses. And always being in the easiest environment is not it doesn't stretch stretch your faculties, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, I've read about I think John Haidt talks about this, and he's not a biologist, he's a psychologist. I think organizational psychologist. But he talks about that some systems are resilient and some aren't. And so what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is true in some situations and not true in other situations. And it is true when
Yeah,
it comes to the immune system for the
yeah,
most part.
right,
But it's not true when it comes to exposing kids to social media or things like that.
right. There are things that just kill you slowly,
Right.
turns out.
Right.
Yeah, and hopefully RFK is gonna be homing in on some of those things in the future here. We'll
Yeah, we'll
see.
see. I mean, that's part of the vibe shift Neil Ferguson's talking
Exactly.
about, where it's about kind of shifting trust from experts to self-sourcing wisdom,
Mhm.
which is dangerous in ways,
Yeah.
but the experts have proven themselves to be dangerous potentially also.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that was where I was saying that, and I didn't completely go down that alley. I was saying that our cognitive models are formed by all of the unconscious elements that nail our foot down in that room. But our cognitive models are also impacted by our education and by our reading and by our conversations with other people and by media that we passively absorb, which I do think you can have a counter narrative in your head that interprets that for you so that you're not psychically vulnerable to it. But remember, if people can influence your cognitive model, they can change your perception of reality. And all they have to do is find that way in. And so, it's a realization that I've had in ceremonies before, is that you gotta keep your fence line mended, right? Like you have to be who is the keeper of your consciousness. And that means you gotta be somewhat subtle. What influences you bring in and what influences you allow in, and there's some antidotal functions to broadening your cognitive models. Once your cognitive model has a certain breadth and a certain resolution, you won't take wooden nickels so easy, right? But that is a growing up process. You got to get your own uh, uh, obfuscations off of your own windshield, and then you have to pay attention to ones that other people are going to want to throw on there. And you got to keep your wipers going. Uh, Make sure your fluid is full so you can wash that nonsense off of your perceptual windows. And
There might be another episode for us to do about minding the fence line, because there are categories of windshield flotsam, that
pernicious influences.
yeah, you can kind of go through a checklist, and so you can actually be pretty deliberate about your fence line management process.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and in martial arts, we look at it from the other way. I'm going to have so much of an easier time defeating this opponent's body if I can confuse his mind, if I can manipulate his perceptions. And we have all kinds of ways to do that, right? We have one method of stepping that we call the thieves step, right? Or a stealing step. And it's a way for me to sneak in and not have him perceive it. And there's some other things I do to make that work, right? Or there's ways that I can want him to perceive me as somebody who's always going to run away, or as somebody who's always going to be there, and I can completely manipulate somebody's perceptions if I concentrate on if I employ those methods, make it way easier for me to do the actual physical encounter. And that's one of the fascinating things about martial arts is because you are facing the unknown embodied as a human. And your presence there is going to determine how you parse that reality and how you respond to it. And then you're gonna know instantaneously whether that worked or not, you know,
Yeah,
or at
there's
least
the
once they
instant
wake
karma.
you up, they'll explain what happened.
Yeah, there's your instant karma.
Yep, instant karma, instant karma. Yep,
Cool.
great.
Well, yeah, maybe let's leave it there for today and then come back to a couple of the loose ends we left in a future episode.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, folks, we'll see everybody. Oh, and remember, we have show notes. If you watch our episodes, you can find out the details on the show notes.
Yeah, that's on our website, thefoolsandsagespodcast.com.
Great. See you next time.